You know that moment when everyone else seems to be sharing something and you pause. Not because you don't have anything to show, but because something in you hesitates. You take the photo, maybe even a good one. You look at it for a second, and then almost quietly, you decide, not this time. It's not a big decision. No drama around it. You just close the app or let the moment pass. And later, if someone asks, you don't really have a clear explanation. It's just how you are. There's a certain kind of person who lives like this. Present, observant, often deeply engaged with their own life, but rarely visible in the way the world expects. And people notice. They might not say it directly, but the assumptions start forming. Maybe you're private, maybe you're insecure, maybe you don't feel confident enough, or maybe you're just not into social media. It gets simplified into something small, something easy to explain. But that simplification misses something important, because when someone consistently chooses not to post their photos, especially in a culture that almost expects it, there's usually more going on beneath the surface than people realize. This isn't just about social media habits. It's about perception. It's about identity. It's about how the mind relates to being seen. And once you start looking at it through that lens, the behavior begins to make a different kind of sense. Psychologically, sharing a photo of yourself isn't just a neutral act. It's a form of self-presentation. It asks the brain to do something very specific, to step outside of the immediate experience and evaluate how that experience will be perceived by others. For some people, that process feels natural, even rewarding. There's a clear loop: capture, share, receive feedback. The brain's reward system, especially pathways linked to dopamine, responds to that feedback. It reinforces the behavior. Over time, it becomes almost automatic. But for others, that same loop doesn't feel as smooth. There's often a heightened awareness that comes online. Instead of just sharing the moment, the mind starts simulating how it will be interpreted, how it might be judged. Not necessarily in a fearful way, but in a deeply analytical one. Research in social cognition shows that some individuals have a more active mentalizing network, areas of the brain that simulate other people's thoughts and perspectives. In everyday life, this can look like empathy, depth, or strong intuition about others. But when it comes to posting a photo, it can turn into something else. Instead of a simple action, it becomes a layered experience. You're not just seeing the image, you're seeing yourself being seen. And that slight shift changes everything. For people who don't often post their photos, there's frequently a subtle preference for staying inside the experience rather than stepping outside of it. It's not about hiding. It's about where attention feels most natural. Some people feel most alive when they're sharing a moment. Others feel most alive when they're fully inside it, uninterrupted by the need to translate it for an audience. And when you belong to the second group, posting can feel like a kind of distance, like turning something real into something slightly more performative. Not fake, just different. There's also another layer that often traces back much earlier. The way someone relates to visibility doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It develops. If you grew up in an environment where attention came with pressure, or where being seen meant being evaluated, corrected, or misunderstood, your nervous system may have learned something very specific. Visibility isn't neutral. It carries weight. Over time, that association doesn't always stay conscious. It becomes a background setting, a quiet calibration. So when a moment arises where you could make yourself visible, like posting a photo, it's not just about the present. There's an undercurrent of past experience shaping how that choice feels. Again, not in a dramatic way, just enough to create a pause, just enough to make you ask, even subtly, is this necessary? And sometimes the answer is no. There's also the role of control. Sharing a photo puts a version of you into a space where you can't fully control how it's received, interpreted, or even remembered. For some people, that lack of control doesn't feel significant. For others, especially those who are more internally oriented, it creates a quiet tension. Not because they're afraid of judgment, but because they're aware of how incomplete any single representation can be. A photo captures a moment, but not the context, not the internal state, not the complexity of who you are. And if you're someone who experiences yourself in a layered, nuanced way, reducing that to a single image can feel slightly misaligned, so you opt out, not as a rejection of the world, but as a way of staying aligned with your own sense of self. Of course, it's important to say this clearly. Not posting your photos doesn't make someone more thoughtful or more self-aware or more anything, and posting them doesn't make someone shallow or attention-seeking or less grounded. These are just different orientation, different ways of relating to visibility, expression, and connection. Some people connect outwardly. Others connect inwardly first. Neither is better. They just move in different directions. But here's where it gets more interesting, because the same pattern that leads someone to hold back from posting often carries a hidden strength. When you're less focused on presenting yourself, your attention has somewhere else to go. It goes into noticing, into experiencing, into processing things at a deeper level before expressing them, if you choose to express them at all. You may find that your memories feel more intact, less filtered through how they appeared to others. You may notice that your sense of identity feels less tied to external feedback. There's a kind of psychological autonomy in that, but there's also a trade-off. When you stay mostly unseen in visible spaces, people have fewer reference points for understanding you. Not because they don't want to, but because they're working with less information, and sometimes that creates distance. Not the kind you can easily explain. Just a quiet gap between how deeply you experience your life and how much of that experience is visible to others. It can lead to moments where you feel slightly out of sync with the social rhythm around you, where sharing feels expected but not quite natural, where you understand the system but don't fully participate in it. And over time, that can shape how others perceive you, even if it doesn't fully reflect who you are. That's the paradox. The same sensitivity that keeps your inner world rich and intact can also make external expression feel more complicated. And yet, none of this points to something being wrong. It points to a specific way of processing the world, a way that prioritizes internal coherence over external visibility, a way that filters experience through meaning before expression, a way that doesn't rush to be seen, but doesn't disappear either. It just chooses carefully. If you recognize yourself in this, it might not feel like a clear identity, more like a pattern you've noticed but never fully named. The quiet hesitation, the preference for presence over presentation, the sense that some parts of your life feel more real when they're not shared. And if that's the case, it's worth understanding that this pattern didn't come from nowhere. It formed for a reason. It adapted to something. It reflects how your mind has learned to balance visibility, safety, and authenticity over time. That doesn't mean it has to stay fixed. It just means it deserves to be understood before it's changed. Because when something makes sense at a deeper level, it stops feeling like a limitation. It starts feeling like a choice. And maybe that's the more important shift. Not suddenly becoming someone who shares everything. Not forcing yourself into a pattern that doesn't feel natural, but recognizing that the way you relate to being seen is something you can engage with more consciously. You can choose when to stay private. You can choose when to step forward. And neither choice has to define you completely. You're allowed to exist outside of the simple categories people tend to use. Visible or invisible, confident or insecure, engaged or withdrawn. Most people are more complex than that, you included. So if you've ever found yourself hesitating before posting a photo, not out of fear but out of something harder to explain, it might not be something you need to fix. It might be something you're beginning to understand. And if this feels familiar in a way you hadn't quite put into words before, there's probably more to uncover about how you relate to attention, identity, and connection than it seems at first. Not all at once, just gradually. In the same quiet way you've been noticing everything else. If any part of this felt familiar, it probably isn't the whole story. It's just one layer of how you relate to being seen. There are other patterns underneath this, subtle ones, that shape how you connect, how you express yourself, and how you hold on to your inner world. And the more you start noticing them, the more your behavior stops feeling random and starts making quiet, personal sense. If this resonated with you, you might want to stay with that curiosity a little longer. You can like the video, share it with someone who might recognize themselves in it, and subscribe if you want to keep exploring these kinds of insights. There's more here than it seems at first, and you don't have to rush to understand all of it at once.